So since we've recently returned to Inazuma, I kinda wanna revisit it. I never got the chance to talk about Inazuma the same way I talked about Fontaine and Natlan because I just didn't have a channel back then, but there's just so much to talk about here. Mainly how Inazuma is still widely considered as something equivalent to the Dark Ages of Genshin, specifically its Archon quest and some characters. The world quests and lore has held up fine in my opinion. Personally, some of my favorite lore is from Inazuma, but the characters have always been labeled as either waifu bait or just infamous for being kinda terrible and underdeveloped. Now, this isn't to say that any of that is true, so let's revisit Inazuma to see if it was really that bad or if we were all just a bit too harsh on it. Let's see what they did right and what could they have done differently. A retrospective. We'll do a retrospective here. As usual, a disclaimer, this is an opinion video. While I do try to stay objective, this is not a professional or well-structured video essay. If you're looking for that, please leave. The Inazuma Archon quest. It's so infamous as one of the worst Archon quests even to this day. And while I think there are a lot of things that made Inazuma's Archon quest not so great, and we will get into all that, but first we have to go back to the year of 2021. We were still fresh into Genshin's release. Most people were done with the content that Mondstadt and Liyue had to offer, which was a problem because one of the biggest selling points of Genshin is the exploration, and while a lot of people also enjoyed the character building and combat, it's safe to say that no one really likes artifact grinding for too long. And at the time between Mondstadt and Inazuma's release, that was it. That was the only thing that you could do after completing the Archon quest, world quests, and story quests that Mondstadt and Liyue had to offer. So players were excited to see what Inazuma was like. We were analyzing everything to see what different items had to say about the Archon, and got even more excited when Zhongli said there was a vision hunt decree going on in Inazuma. There was also Scaramouche, a harbinger that we know was from Inazuma, and for long-time fans of Hoyoverse games, they were also excited to see Genshin's version of Raiden Mei. Also, if you play Genshin, you probably have a lot of appreciation of Japanese media and culture, aka you're probably a weeb. So getting an entire region that's based on Japan was probably really exciting for a lot of people. Safe to say the expectations for Inazuma was sky high. We had a nation that was closed off, an Archon that looked incredibly intimidating and was set up to be the antagonist. We had the release of Ayaka, who was one of the first characters that we saw in Genshin's beta. It was a lot. So with that in mind, I'm gonna do a brief and butchered recap of the Inazuma Archon quest because it has been a while and I also want to look back to see if it was really that bad. Again, this is not a detailed recap, so bear with me a little. I know Inazuma has a prologue, but I don't really have much to say about it. It mostly introduces Kazuha and the significance of visions, and because the prologue only features Kazuha and Beidou, it was actually the perfect time to get to know Kazuha's motivations and him as a character. There's actually proper time and space to know why visions are important to him, like him specifically, and also why he fled Inazuma, and most importantly, how the Vision Hunt Decree has affected him as a character and as a citizen in Inazuma. This is important because the Vision Hunt Decree is part of the plot and setting of the Inazuma story, so having that plot affect a character in the story is important. And how they presented how the ongoing events in Inazuma is actually personally affecting a character is such a great way for us the players to understand that character better. They also established how ruthless the Raiden Shogun is in the prologue, so they were definitely building up suspense that this Archon is different from the previous two that we've met. So the prologue is kinda slow, but it's actually not that bad. We even get to see a lot of groundwork for what's gonna happen in Inazuma from this quest. It was actually pretty okay. Going into Act 1, it was also pretty alright. We already spent a bit of time getting to know Kazuha, so going into the nation with him and Beidou, who at that point was a character we haven't really seen much of, was actually really cool. And it makes sense because Beidou is the pirate captain who can actually smuggle us into this closed-off nation. Arriving in Inazuma, we were introduced to Toma, who is Beidou's business partner and who also works for the Yashiro Commission. If you forgot, there are 3 commissions in Inazuma that are led by 3 different noble clans. There's the Kanjo Commission, which is the financial arm of Inazuma. They are led by the Hiragi clan. These are the people you meet in Rito. There's also the Tenryo Commission, and they're in charge of public security, so they're the ones handling military affairs and led by the Kujo clan. The last one is, of course, the Yashiro Commission, in charge of cultural affairs in Inazuma and led by none other than the Kamisato clan. And what's cool about the Tri Commission is that all of them are actually integrated in the Archon quest from the very beginning. Like, every character from each commission plays a role in the Archon quest. They're not just like a government that stands in the background of the setting of the story. So back to the Archon quest. When we reached Inazuma, we first arrived in Rito, and Inazuma is in complete lockdown because of the Sakoku decree, meaning it's almost impossible for foreigners and travelers to even enter the country. And the ones who need to leave the country are also kind of they're stuck in Rito too. Luckily for us, we got Toma and he has all the answers. He also reveals that the Kanjo Commission is scamming all of the foreigners that are stuck in Rito with absurd taxes. So there we also immediately learn that other than the very questionable Sakoku Decree and Vision Hunt Decree, the Tri Commission are also pretty shady and not to be trusted, and they're mostly probably kinda corrupt. Toma knows the traveler wants to meet the Raiden Shogun and he agrees to help as long as they help him sort a few things out in return. So the first thing that Toma needed us to do was help him stop the Kanjo Commission from scamming people. So we did that, and Toma said sure, he'll introduce us to the Shogun, but first we needed to come to the Komori tea house to meet Ayaka, who's heard about the traveler's feats in Mondstadt and Liyue. And she also hopes that they can change the tide of the Vision Hunt Decree. Toma also didn't actually get the traveler out of Rito, so they needed to figure out how to get their hands on a traveler permit. So that's how the traveler got roped into helping Hiragi Chisato and Kujo Kamaji in their Romeo-Juliet-esque relationship. But despite that, we finally get the permit and we can finally set foot into Inazuma. For real this time. We head to the Komori tea house and we learn more about the Vision Hunt Decree from Toma. We followed him into the Kamisato estate where we talked a bit with Ayaka. And just when she asked the traveler to help with the Vision Hunt Decree, the traveler said no. They were truly focused on their goal in meeting the Raiden Shogun and finding their sibling, nothing else. Disappointed, Ayaka persuaded the traveler to visit 3 different locations to see just how badly the Vision Hunt Decree is affecting the people of Inazuma for themselves. And this is interesting to me in 2 ways. One, it's definitely a form of storytelling that's done well enough. We're actually getting to see why this cause is so important for Inazuma. People are suffering, even though the ones suffering are the minority. That doesn't mean that the people should just turn a blind eye towards a decree that's clearly harming them. The game is not trying to just persuade the traveler, they're trying to persuade the players into caring for the cause too, and therefore to be invested in the overall story. 2, it's also just an interesting expansion of what visions mean to the people in Teyvat. We know it's a source of elemental power and everything, and we know that visions manifest from will and ambitions of each individual, and seeing what happens when it's ripped away from them by their own god is an interesting concept to explore. They also took some time to let the players see how the humans in Inazuma just didn't understand what the Shogun was doing. Like, they know she wants to preserve eternity, but they can't understand why she's even confiscating visions and how that aligns with her vision of eternity. Was this done well? Did it get players to be invested enough into putting a stop to the Vision Hunt Decree? Personally, for me, it was okay. I think it would have been more effective if they had at least put one character that's playable or someone who was more memorable and not just 3 NPCs. But I think it would have been more interesting if they had one playable character who we know who actually lost their vision or something. Like, we know Ito got his vision confiscated during the Vision Hunt Decree, and it would have been interesting to see how losing one's vision could affect someone like Ito. I know he hasn't been released yet at that point, but I'm just saying. So after seeing it firsthand and also meeting a few vital characters along the way, the traveler finally agrees to help the people of Inazuma in putting a stop to the Vision Hunt Decree. The traveler also gets to meet Yoimiya and Kujo Sara for the first time. Kujo Sara is of course the first significant character of the Tenryo Commission, and we'll talk about her a bit later. But with that, we've reached the end of Act 1. And it was mostly okay. It definitely wasn't horrible. Before we get to Act 2 though, we need to go on a side quest with these two girls. I've always find it kind of funny that they basically forced us to do Ayaka and Yoimiya's story quest before progressing to Act 2. I'll touch on these two a bit more later when we talk about the characters, but what was the point of this? The story quests had no impact on the main story at all, so for me it was like I was forced to sit through a filler episode in the middle of something important. I think the game just wanted to build attachment to Ayaka and Yoimiya since they were the featured banner 5 stars at the time, but this is not the way to do it, man, and I think they realized that since they've never forced a story quest to be the requirement to continue an archon quest again after this, I think. Moving on to Act 2, and this act actually starts pretty intensely. Toma, who's been a friend to the traveler since they arrived in Inazuma, is going to end up as the 100th victim of the Vision Hunt decree, and something I never understood is why the puppet shogun wanted to commemorate this event. Like, as a puppet, I just find it funny she was the one to instigate it, or maybe it's just but that means she wasn't just complicit in the Vision Hunt decree by letting it happen. She's actually culpable. But anyway, the traveler goes right into saving Toma and they confront the Raiden Shogun for the first time. And this is actually done in a really cool way. I think the Shogun's entrance made her look very intimidating, as she should, because she is the first archon that's also the antagonist. She looks menacing and it was a great cutscene. Now, I actually really like this cutscene because I think it does A's introduction as an archon justice. It also gave the traveler and Toma a really cool character moment. We came here to save Toma and Toma ended up saving the traveler. Paimon even has a really sweet moment where she panics when the traveler is just lying on the ground. The problem now, the traveler becomes a wanted criminal, so they can't really meet the Raiden Shogun because she will try to kill them on the spot. So seeing how terrible the Vision Hunt decree is, they go to Watatsumi Island to meet with the resistance. And boy, this was actually a really good build up for the resistance. So far we've seen an oppressive leader who also happens to be a god, and there was seemingly no hope for the vision holders in Inazuma. Despite that, there's still a group of people brave enough to oppose, again, a literal god. And that group is just made out of regular humans. So they were set up to be this intriguing group of characters that you will now get to meet and maybe come up with a plan and to put an end to the Vision Hunt decree. So we make our way to Yashiori Island and we meet my least favorite NPC in the game. Yes, 4 years later and I am still a certified Teppei hater. I am his anti. I don't care if you like him, I'm entitled to my opinion, okay? And the reason I don't like him is because he represents everything wrong with Inazuma's storytelling. But that didn't really start in Act 2. In Act 2, he was really just the guy who introduced us to Goro and the Resistance. We meet Goro and we see the state of the Resistance and it's not great. Like, it was raining the first time you set foot into Yashiori Island and the vibes were just awful, which is kind of something you would expect in a war. The traveler spends a bit of time with the Resistance and Goro actually tells Teppei to show the traveler around and then join him in the front lines when they're ready. I just never understood why they didn't just make Goro, you know, the character that's playable that I might actually care about, to be the one to show us around. Is it because he needs to go to the front lines immediately? Because to me, it didn't seem like he was rushing to go anywhere when we meet him. We get to the front lines and we see him in a standoff against Kujosara and the Tenryo Commission. Since the traveler is wanted by the Shogun as the enemy of eternity, Sara obviously wants the Resistance to hand over the traveler, but Goro said no, which is very admirable of him. But I also find it hard to believe his speech about how the traveler is one of the Resistance now and they will not betray their own. The traveler met the Resistance like 5 minutes ago. Goro is basically just protecting a person he just met and is risking a lot of things in the process, like the survival of his own people. It would be more believable if the traveler had actually spent time with Goro instead of random NPCs, but you can already see that certain story beats are just not landing in this act because of how rushed it is in execution. But I personally got distracted by the cool cutscene that we got of Beidou, Kazuha, and of course Kokomi saving the day. With the help of Beidou and Kazuha, the Resistance was able to push back the Tenryo Commission. The one thing I noticed now that I didn't notice in my first playthrough almost 4 years ago is how short Act 2 actually is. For context, Act 2 is almost 2.5 hours long, but Act 2 of Inazuma is only 1 hour. And I genuinely thought that only having 3 acts was already a crime that doomed Inazuma's pacing, and this actually just added to it. So for comparison, the prologue, the one with Kazuha, the one that I thought did a fairly good job in introducing one character, was also 1 hour long. So they deadass tried to establish and flesh out multiple characters and multiple events and even an entire faction that's extremely important to the plot in the same amount of time. And in that 1 hour, they built up the Resistance, Kokomi, and Goro so much only to waste most of our time on Teppei. Why? Anyway, after officially meeting Kokomi, we also officially entered the last act of Inazuma, which is Act 3. And again, there were just so many things that they tried to cram into one act. It's actually kind of funny. To list a few down, we just met the Resistance. There's also the entire thing with the corruption in the Tenryo Commission. There's also the Fatui fanning the flame, a Fatui harbinger going rogue. There's also an entire backstory that we need to learn about A because she's supposed to be a complex character. That's a lot, right? So tell me why they thought it was a good idea to spend so much freaking time with Teppei again. When I say a lot, I do mean a lot, especially when there's a million other important things that we could be doing in the quest. I don't understand why Teppei is supposed to be the character that pushed the traveler over the edge to the point that they were so blinded by rage that they rushed into the delusion factory. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that the Resistance got played by the Fatui because Kokomi, who is supposed to be the genius master strategist, somehow thought it was a good idea to accept anonymous help and supplies. I get that they were desperate, but you would think someone who's a genius could have seen past that or at least have a contingency plan that can prevent her own soldiers from dying. I'm not a genius, so I don't know. I'm just saying. But the Fatui were distributing delusions to the Resistance, and because they were desperate, a lot of them started using it, thinking that it would help them in the war. But obviously it backfired and became fatal for a lot of them, including Teppei. So Teppei died like not long after the delusion plot started. I actually checked and it turns out Teppei died roughly around 15 minutes after Kokomi mentions that she accepted help. So yeah, his health deteriorated to the point of death in the span of 15 minutes. 15 whole minutes. The traveler rushed to the delusion factory in a fit of rage where they encountered Scaramouche. And then they talked briefly before the traveler collapsed and was saved by Yaemiko. After that, we just jumped into a training arc with Yaemiko to prepare against the Shogun. And then we ran into Kujosara, which kicked off the plot of the corruption of the Tenryo Commission. You get it, right? There's just a lot of things happening too quickly, and at the same time, nothing is getting fleshed out. Once we reach Tenshukaku, we actually get to fight Shinora and witness her death right after the fight, and that concludes Shinora's story in the game, apparently. The Shogun actually lets the traveler leave Tenshukaku before attacking them as soon as they step out. We got a cool scene between Kazuha and the Shogun though. I just find it funny that the Resistance were rushing to Tenshukaku in hopes that they would be able to fight against this, which to their credit, Kazuha did manage to block a strike from the Shogun herself. But the traveler was pulled into the plane of Euthymia, and Yaemiko is also there somehow, and the fight against A begins. Now, the concept of the final fight against A is actually really cool. We're not there to kill her, but as Yaemiko would put it, we're there to shake her will. The fight is a fight to force her to open her eyes. The traveler managed to do so with the ambition of the vision holders of Inazuma helping them, and I personally don't mind this concept. I've seen some people think that it's just another power of friendship moment, but again, since the point of the fight is to shake A's will, having the people's ambition be the force that finally shakes her awake is actually a good concept. The physical fight is just the medium that they're using to tell this story, and I like that. I think fights, especially final fights, can be a good storytelling method if they mean something. We've actually seen a lot of good fights in shonen animes, not just because they're cool, but because they mean something. The characters actually grow or learn something from that fight. The best kinds of duels and fights in a story, well, to me at least, is always a fight that represents a clash of ideals. And that's what happened to A and the Traveler. They were actually building up to a fight that challenges A's character and ideals. It's just too bad that the execution of that concept was pretty janky and rushed. I think they did this a lot better in A's second story quest. That's why A's fight against her own puppet felt so significant, because it wasn't just a fight scene just for the sake of an epic fight. That duel had a story. It was the clash of A's changing losing will and the shogun being a representation of her old ideals that she's outgrown. Sadly, it was poorly executed in the Archon quest. After that fight, the quest just ends and Yaemiko info dumps a lot of lore all at once. And yeah, that concludes the Archon quest for Inazuma. In summary, they were working with a lot of good material there, but there were just a lot of wasted potential and they fumbled the execution so badly. I personally remember the exact moment I finished the Archon quest and I was like, wait, what about the Resistance? What about Scaramouche? What about A? And I also remember just thinking to myself, is that it? Now, every region has had its fair share of criticisms, but Inazuma was just a different level. I know what you're thinking, it can't be that bad if you see how popular the Raiden Shogun is, but there's a lot to uncover here also. Before we get into A, let's talk about the cast of the Inazuma Archon quest because there's a lot. I'm gonna focus on the featured 5 stars first, and the first significant one that we meet is Kazuha. I think Kazuha's role in the Inazuma Archon quest overall is pretty straightforward. He's supposed to be the introduction for the traveler to the ongoing conflict in Inazuma and how said conflict is actually really harmful. Like, he was the main focus of the prologue and his story is actually really intriguing. He's someone that you see as really chill, he doesn't hold any grudges or real anger on the surface. But once you actually know what happened to him in Inazuma, it actually makes him a more compelling character because if anyone should be mad, it's him. He should be mad. He had this best friend who had a dream to see the Raiden Shogun's infamous Musono Hitotachi, and said friend eventually did see it when he faced the death sentence after losing a duel before the throne against Kujo Sara. The only reason he got in that duel was because he was in opposition to the Vision Hunt decree and he was brave enough to die for his cause. It makes Kazuha's friend admirable, and Kazuha managed to escape Inazuma right after he snatched away his friend's vision after he died in the hands of the Shogun. This is obviously a traumatic event and we see the after effects of it in Kazuha as a character. We see his grief, we see why he's on the run and is unable to return to his homeland that he probably still loves despite its flaws. We also see him return to fight for the cause that he and his friend believed in the middle of the Archon quest. He even got the chance to protect the traveler from the Shogun, which is actually such a good way to end his character arc in the Inazuma Archon quest. I think Kazuha is actually the only character that felt like he actually had a character arc in Inazuma, which is why a lot of people just felt he was the true main character because he went from someone who was in exile and dealing with his grief to basically someone who had the courage to come back and face his demons. Without Kazuha coming back, the traveler would have been cooked. He was the one who was brave enough to raise his sword against the Raiden Shogun after hearing his friend's voice through his vision, and he just did this. So while Inazuma fumbled a lot of things, I don't think they fumbled Kazuha. I'm not saying his character arc was done perfectly, but it's there at least. I've talked about Ayaka several times and usually it's to express my frustration with traveler simping, but here I will just look at her as a character in the story regardless of how she behaves towards the traveler. She's actually pretty okay. Her role has always been the person who cares enough about her own people. She's viewed in high regard as the Shirasagi Himegimi because of her compassion and her own individual merit. She's the one who went out of her way to get in touch with the traveler who she knows can make a difference because her own hands were tied. She's a powerful figure who actually gives a shit, but as powerful as she is, she can't go against the Archon without jeopardizing everyone in her life, which includes the Kamisato clan and also everyone close to them. But despite that, she cares enough to try and make changes. I've said this before, but while I do like the premise of her story quest being about her relationship with her mother, I think it focused way too much on her relationship with the traveler. Now, I'm not saying her relationship with the traveler is a bad thing. It just makes it feel forced to have that quest in the middle of the civil war going on in Inazuma. I get that they wanted us to be more familiar with her as a character, especially because she was the featured character, but I think the tone of the story quest and also how it was executed just didn't land. I don't mind seeing her develop a real friendship with someone who she sees as an equal like the traveler, but the way the quest presented itself was like she never had any real friends, and that's such a disservice towards Toma, who's clearly her friend. But I get it. Maybe it's the fact that the traveler was someone outside of the Yashiro Commission and was clearly intriguing because they've seen the world outside of Inazuma, and that's clearly something Ayaka finds fascinating. Her relationship with the traveler can actually add to her character, but it's just the execution that I I don't really like. The Archon quest did showcase how Ayaka was extremely distraught and was actually ready to sacrifice everything to save Toma, who is a dear friend to her when he was in trouble. It was a good character moment, and Ayaka is one of the characters that I felt like served their purpose in the story. Yaemiko is actually a character that I personally really like just based off of personality alone. I just really like that she is the standard sly kitsune trope, and I find that entertaining. A character doesn't have to be groundbreaking for them to be an enjoyable character. Sometimes they can just be a trope, but if that trope is executed well enough, then what's the harm? Yaemiko was actually presented in a pretty consistent manner. She has only been shown to care about a few things, and those things are A, Inazuma, and her publishing house. And everything that she does has always been in the best interest of those things. She's the only person capable of seeing A for who she is, someone who's dealing with her grief in a very unhealthy way, which is by shutting down and not really dealing with it. Without Yaemiko, there will be no bridge between the traveler and the players to A, the real A, not the Raiden Shogun. So she's an extremely important character, and for the most part, she does play that role. For most of Act 3, we spent a lot of time with Yaemiko, and she does play an important role up until the end, but it gets to the point that she becomes the exposition dump character too. It gets to a point where the game just kinda gives up on showing you things and instead will just use Yaemiko to feed you that information in the form of a very long dialogue, which is not great for storytelling. It's not as fun learning that Scaramouche has gone rogue instead of seeing it. It's also not as fun to learn the truth about Raiden Shogun and A through dialogue instead of, seeing it on screen. Personality-wise, I do like that Yaemiko has a very distinct personality. She's not very nice sometimes, and I like that. I think it's safe to say that most of the characters in the game are very friendly towards the travelers, so when we have one that is kind of mean sometimes is actually something I welcome very much. I just like having a diverse pool of personalities. That's why I enjoy characters like Yaemiko and Scaramouche. So there wasn't really anything wrong with Yaemiko. She was just used in a way that enables lazy writing and poor execution in the Inazuma Archon quest. For Yoimiya, I don't really have that much to say about her. She was a fun addition to the cast, but she's a civilian at the end of the day. And she was a good side character in a way that she had a very unique role, but I think for most of us, we just didn't really expect her to be more involved than she was in the Archon quest. So she was mostly fine. I'm glad that she got her second story quest though, because I think that's where she shined the most. Kokomi though, I've made an entire video about her if you've never seen that one, but if you did, then you would know that I did not like how they handled her as a character at all. I think they pushed too hard for her to be the genius strategist without actually knowing how to write a genius character, which is why she fell flat and we got ridiculous plotlines and moments where it feels like she's the opposite of a competent leader. The story quest also just didn't do much better. She does seem like someone who's trying her best despite being weighed down by unrealistic expectations, but that part of her character gets heavily overshadowed by pushing the narrative that she's a genius. That and the criminally short screen time that she has in the Archon quest just made it worse for her as a character and just for the resistance overall. You know that moment at the end where some of the resistance members came to the traveler's aid at Tenshukaku? You would think that this is Kokomi's actions, like it's part of her plan that she foresaw the traveler needing help, but it's actually Ayato who was behind the resistance getting to Tenshukaku on time. Speaking of Ayato, he was just not in the Archon quest for some reason. I know it's because he wasn't released yet, and the excuse that they had was because he was someone who does things from the background, like in the shadows, because he's also in charge of the Shumatsuban. But it's kind of funny when you think about it. Like, Inazuma was in full civil war mode, and Ayaka was ready to step into the front lines to save Toma, who is also a good friend of Ayato's, but the man was just never to be found or really mentioned at all because he wasn't released yet. So there isn't really anything to say about Ayato, at least not in the Archon quest. He does get a fun role later on though, like he appears in events and everything, and is mostly there to scheme with Yaemiko, which is actually an interesting character dynamic that I like. I think a lot of people back then compared them to Jesse and James from Pokemon. They're a fun duo, I'm a fan. I want to talk about Ito, but like Ayato, he wasn't released until much later into the Inazuma patch, and I think Ito specifically was just such a fun addition to the cast. He was so chaotic, and his dynamic with the Inazuma characters and the Traveler and even Paimon is actually always fun in some ways. So I'm glad that they added Ito. Now for the 4 stars, I think for the most part the 4 stars are fine. Like Toma was the 4 star that we got to spend the most time with, he got the most spotlight, and he actually played an important role in the Archon quest. As previously mentioned, he was the one who helped the Traveler in Rito, he was the link to Ayaka, he directed the Traveler to the Resistance, so he was actually more important and ironically did a lot more for the story than Kokomi ever did. I'm not a Kokomi hater, I swear, I like her just fine. It's just that she had too little screen time to even have an impact. And the same thing goes for Goro. We meet him for like 5 seconds and he just appears in cool cutscenes and we don't see him anymore after that. Kujo Sara though. This one is a bit personal because I was actually really hyped for Sara. For one, she's a Tengu and she looks so badass in the trailer. In the first few moments that we do meet her, she also just fit her role really well. She's this authority figure who doesn't take shit, but she has a lot of depth and humanity to her. And when things were finally unraveling for the Tenryu Commission, I was actually excited to see how Sara would handle the betrayal of her own family that took her in, and also seeing the figure that she idolized and puts on a pedestal, the Electro Archon herself, is actually someone who's very flawed and might not have the best interest of her country when it comes to her actions. Sara was someone who just started to wake up and think for herself after blindly following orders from people she looked up to. It's an interesting character arc, it's an interesting story to follow. And to see that the conclusion for that story was her being knocked unconscious and then just never mentioned again at the end of the Archon quest was disappointing, to put it mildly. So that was most of the Inazuma cast that I wanted to mention. Now all that's left is A. Just kidding, before we discuss A, I would like to mention Teppei once again because he's the honorary member of the Inazuma cast. I say this because he has more focus in the story than most of the actual characters. We spend the first half of Act 3 focusing on Teppei and his character arc, if you could even call it that. Like, we end Act 2 expecting to spend more time with the Resistance and getting to know the person leading the group of people that is actively at war with the Archon. You know, Kokomi and Goro. And Teppei was fine, he was the NPC that got us there, so I didn't really expect to spend more time with him or for him to have any impact on the story. Teppei just perfectly captures everything wrong with Genshin's storytelling sometimes. He's an NPC that steals very important screen time from characters that desperately needed them in order to create a compelling narrative, and he also as an NPC doesn't really add anything to the Inazuma characters or even the Traveler. They tried to, but it was just executed so poorly that it feels like Teppei had no impact. NPCs can work in stories like there's a reason why Karkata can evoke a lot of emotions and why Nouvelette's story quest tugs at some people's heartstrings. And it's because it adds layers to the characters in the story quest. Teppei is a plot device at best, and it's really bad when we've only known him for roughly around 5 minutes before he just started dying because of the delusion. And while it's implied in-game that his health decayed over the course of a few weeks, but to the players, that's less than 20 minutes. He's actually funny to me because somehow he took too much time from so many characters, yet he also didn't have enough time for his own story to even be executed properly. How? How is that possible? His only purpose is to justify the Traveler's anger towards the Fatui to the point that they would storm off to the Delusion Factory in a blind rage, which I personally just didn't buy at all. Sure, I felt bad for Teppei, but did he elicit this much emotion from me? No, not really. The time that we spent running around with him could have been used to spend more time getting to know Kokomi, to maybe understand her thought process as to why she accepted help from an anonymous sponsor that's obviously shady. Like, if the Resistance is doing that badly, show us more of that then before showing Kokomi accepting the deal. We could have also spent more time with Goro and see him in distress that his comrades were dying from delusions and he's powerless to save them. And there would be opportunities for him to question Kokomi's judgment as he saw how bad things were getting. But no, after the whole Teppei thing, the Traveler goes to the Delusion Factory, passes out, and wakes up in Narukami Shrine. And that's pretty much it for the Resistance part of the Inazuma Archon quest. Okay, so with my Teppei tangent out of the way, let's actually talk about A. Inazuma is kinda weird because while A is now a good character and is very popular, she wasn't always that way, at least in terms of how she was presented as a character. The best way to put it is that they fumbled her pretty badly in the beginning. A is the archon. She is the most important character in that region. She's the first archon that's presented as an antagonist to the Traveler. She's also the first female archon. It's safe to say the hype for her was real. And like everything else in this video, we know that the earlier butchering of her characterization is due to the very fast pacing of the Inazuma Archon quest. A at her core is an extremely complex character. There are so many layers to her and what drives her actions in the story and as a character. I can't get into a full analysis of A here, but at the heart of it, her actions, at least during the launch of Inazuma, were mainly driven by grief. She chose to be in isolation due to the grief of losing her twin sister and most of her close friends all at once in the Cataclysm. And at the start of the Archon quest, she is dealing with it in a very flawed way. And the whole premise of Inazuma is that her own nation is suffering because she is unable to process her own emotions. A has always been a very flawed and complex character. Like since the beginning, she was always complex. It was just executed really badly. Now for most of the Inazuma Archon quest, we only interacted with the Shogun Puppet. The Shogun Puppet wanted to kill the Traveler because they're an anomaly, an enemy to eternity. But A herself didn't really make an appearance until the very end of Act 3 where the Traveler made it into the plane of Euthymia. And you can't really flesh out a character that has very complex motivations and actions in less than 20 minutes. We see her surrendering after the ambitions of her own people overwhelm her via the Traveler, and she said that she needed to self-reflect for the first time in 500 years. She was going to face her grief and most probably take accountability for her actions. Technically, she doesn't have to take accountability because she's the god and it's not like anyone can hold her accountable in any real way, but she does seem remorseful and wants to understand her people a lot better. Like she literally caused a lot of suffering for her own people. She might not be the one enforcing those rules because it was mostly the Shogun Puppet, but she's culpable for all of them because she said she knew everything that was happening in Inazuma. The only other time we get to spend any real time with A is in her story quest, and her first story quest, like the rest of Inazuma during its earlier patches, were just not executed well at all. It was good in concept, like it wanted to show A who's been in stasis for 500 years coming to terms with the ever-changing Inazuma, but it just presented it in a really weird tone. Like the Traveler were just a bit too friendly with A after only getting to know her at the end of the Archon quest. And for me personally, I didn't see any real reason why the Traveler would be so trusting of A, especially after seeing how the Traveler can be quite indifferent or harsh to Archons or people who've done less harm to others than A. Yes, A didn't mean any harm, like she wasn't malicious towards her own people, but the impact of her actions are still there. Honestly, in my opinion, the Traveler should have treated A the same way they treat Child, like friendly but also still a bit distrusting of her, and A can just earn their trust over time. It's how character growth works. It's how we show character dynamics evolve, and that's what will make a character more compelling and just more fleshed out. The way they present her first story quest is also almost like a companion date quest, which is bizarre. There are much better ways that A can face the changes in Inazuma without framing it like they're on a date with the Traveler. It can be done in a much more nuanced way, like maybe just a flashback scene to show the juxtaposition of the past and the present, the same way they did Nouvelette's quest when they showed how people treated the Melusines in the past versus how they treat them now. Now, I know the Vision Holders are technically the minority in Inazuma, but the Vision Hunt Decree and everything else caused a lot of chaos, right? I just never understood how everyone was just so happy to see her despite knowing that their own Archon let a civil war happen. I can sort of believe that no one can actually hold her accountable because she's the god. Why is everyone fawning over her? I would expect them to be scared and anxious, but not in the way because they admire her. I mean, they can admire her for being a great warrior, obviously, but they're acting like they're fanboys and fangirls of someone who isn't really a good leader. There's not one person who was maybe kinda resentful towards her because of her decisions. I'm not saying someone should just randomly lunge at her on the street, but even a stink eye towards her would have been enough, I think. Like, at least it will show that she's actually facing the consequences of her actions in some way. At the time, most people went into that quest directly after the Inazuma Archon quest, so I can understand the whiplash. The tone of A's story quest is just so different from everything else in Inazuma, and especially the final act of the Archon quest. But honestly, they finally had the time and also just a better grasp of how to show A's complexity in her second second story quest, which didn't come out until much later, but it still counts. A's second story quest really handled her character overall with a lot more nuance and with a more somber tone, which is, in my personal opinion, a lot more suitable for her story since her whole character is written around grief. And in her second story quest, she was able to face her grief and overcome it head on. It's actually one of the best story quests in the game, if not the best to this day, because of how well executed it was and how much it fleshed her out as a character. Now, this is more recent. It's way far past the INAZUMA patch, but I think it's interesting that they managed to revisit A's story that they've never touched on before, and that's her grief over Mikoshi Chiyo. If you didn't know, she was one of A's best friends who fought alongside her in the Cataclysm, but after a monster of the abyss swallowed her whole, she was never the same. Chiyo raised her sword against A in her madness, and A managed to cut her down. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I just didn't expect to see this part of A's lore to come to life 4 whole ass years later after the release of INAZUMA, but I was just very pleasantly surprised. It's one of the reasons I wanted to make this video, and it's mostly just to rant and reminisce about the time that I had in INAZUMA. 2021 was just such a different time for me. We were deep into COVID, and I basically just spent all of my free time running around INAZUMA. So seeing the game revisit something like this just triggered the nostalgia for me. Anyway, back to A. It seems like with every patch and every improvement to the game's story, Hoyo is now able to handle her with nuance and show her complexity as a character. A might be very one note in the beginning and might seem shallow or even just come off as not a good person because of how she was handled as a character, but she is now definitely established as one of the most complex and nuanced and also flawed characters in the game, which is cool. I personally really like her now. I think the Traveler's role in INAZUMA is a bit strange because they're actually really necessary for the plot, but at the same time, there are some moments where it felt performative, but not too much in a sense that it rivals what happened in Natlan. The Traveler's role is actually really understandable in the beginning of the Archon quest, like Ayaka reaching out to them after hearing their accomplishments and how they managed to help save Mondstadt and Liyue is actually really believable. And it's not like the people of INAZUMA can fight against a god without outside help, so their role in INAZUMA is definitely necessary. And I actually think it's really good that they spent a lot of time just trying to establish why the Traveler should care about the people of INAZUMA in the first place. Actually, the fact that the Traveler refused to help because they just wanted to find their sibling is already a refreshing direction that they took. It actually made the Traveler look like they have some sense of agency and aren't just mindlessly following people's requests for the sake of a plot, so they were headed in a good direction. But I think like everything else that went bad in INAZUMA, it really started in Act 3 where the Traveler was made into a squad captain in the Resistance that did absolutely nothing for the story other than to glaze them with the title that they barely earned. It actually baffles me how much time we wasted just getting the Traveler to get this title only for it to lead to nowhere and for it to have no impact at all, considering we just leave the Resistance like 2 seconds after Teppei's death. But I think that's where the performative Traveler treatment actually ends. Everywhere else, they pretty much feel like they're a necessary part of the story. They're there to move the plot forward. Looking at important moments in INAZUMA, like when saving Toma, the Traveler 100% needed to be the one to do so because they already established a clear reason why Ayaka can't go. And Ayato, even if he's around, will probably not be able to do anything either because of their political status. So it's consistent with the narrative that the Traveler is the one having to step in. In the fight against the Tenryu Commission, it felt like Goro was exaggerating a bit on how important the Traveler was to the Resistance, considering they just got there. Maybe he recognized how powerful the Traveler is and how much of an asset they can be to the Resistance. But comrades, come on now. But if we ignore that, the focus of that whole segment is actually on the INAZUMA characters, like it was on Kazuha, Beidou, Goro, and Sarah, and of course on Kokomi later on when she arrived. And for the final battle, considering who they're going up against, I think it's fitting that the Traveler is the carrier of the ambitions of the people of INAZUMA. If we also take into account where the battle took place, which is in the plane of Euthymia, a realm where most people can't get into, the Traveler's presence as an anomaly to say that is pretty understandable. The only part where I feel like the Traveler is made to feel more important than they actually are in the story quests, but the problem with that is just the fan service lens that they used for most of the early Inazuma story quests. So in hindsight, the Traveler's role in Inazuma was actually a lot more consistent and nuanced than Natlan. I would say their presence in the story felt a lot less performative than what we got recently, like in the last act of the Natlan Archon quest. So was it really that bad? Yes, I'm just kidding. I would say yeah, it was that bad in terms of pacing, and Inazuma being the earliest case of Genshin's missed potential. To put into perspective, okay, Inazuma's Archon quest was around 6 hours including gameplay, while Sumeru's was around 14 hours. Again, that was just the main problem with Inazuma, and also just how Hoyo at the time seemed to not be able to really grasp the right tone for these kinds of narratives, especially ones where they tried to make the most important character that they're trying to sell as an antagonist of the story, and also having it set in a country that's going through a civil war. Selling a complex character, especially one that starts out as an antagonist, will just need a lot more time to fully flesh them out and for the players to really understand who they are as a person, which is why ironically I think they handled Scaramouche / the Wanderer a lot better. He was technically introduced in patch 1.1 and made appearances in Inazuma, got an entire event focusing on his backstory, and then became more prominent in the Sumeru Archon quest, and he had an entire interlude quest after that just dedicated to him. It really set the stage for the start of his redemption arc. That's why they were able to sell his growth and in turn him as a complex character. Another good example of a morally gray and complex character that they handled well is Arlecchino. They never tried to paint her in any kind of light other than what she actually is. They just integrated her into the story and trust that a lot of people love complex characters, and she is pretty popular, I would say. This is just a theory, but I think they wanted A to look good for her banner, which is why we got a story quest that was so different in tone. They also placed light-hearted story quests for two characters that they're trying to market as waifus back in the middle of the Archon quest that's about a civil war breaking out. Ayaka and Yoimiya's story quests are, again, okay. They're pretty entertaining, actually. And I also kind of get why they decided to place those quests in the middle of the Archon quest, because the Traveler becomes a wanted person in Inazuma after Act 2, and it doesn't get resolved until the end of the Archon quest. So they probably thought that the only option to market these characters while also showing off Inazuma's landscape was just to insert their story quest in the middle of the Archon quest before the Traveler becomes wanted, which is understandable but also not a very good decision narratively. And the only solution that I can think of to avoid that is just to make the tone of the story quest more fitting with where the main quest was currently at, but obviously they wanted to go through the quest with a more casual tone, which didn't work. As established, Inazuma is where most of the characters were just starved for screen time. It's also the patch with the most infuriating exposition dump of incredibly important lore. It's the one with record number of rushed plot lines. Meanwhile, in Sumeru, I don't think any character lacked screen time. If anything, everyone got a chance to shine somehow. So in combination with the pacing and the underdeveloped characters, it's safe to say that Inazuma is definitely the weakest in terms of writing, narrative, and characters. It's not unplayable, it's definitely not the garbage dumpster fire that some people make it seem to be. I think the ending, despite the flaws that's glaringly present in Act 3, was actually pretty cool. The moment leading up to the final battle against A, where Kazuha's arc finally came full circle and he managed to block a killing strike from the Raiden Shogun, was actually a really good scene. It wraps up Kazuha's character arc where he gets to defend his new friend, which is the Traveler, against the very same thing that took his friend away from him. And it's made even more poetic with how he was only able to do this because of his late friend's ambition. It's a moment that Kazuha's character deserved after facing so much loss and grief and even exile because of the Vision Hunt decree and everything A has done. So let's give credit where credit is due. Despite its flaws, Inazuma had a lot of good moments. Is it still the weakest Archon quest in execution? Yes, I personally think so. But maybe it was necessary. Hoyo has overall improved their writing, especially in Sumeru, Fontaine, and even Natlan. Like, I criticized Natlan a lot, but it's still a big improvement in comparison to the earlier patches of Inazuma. Hoyo has managed to give most of the characters that they kind of butchered in Inazuma more screen time and therefore fleshed them out a lot more in recent events. The best example of this is obviously basically A, like I mentioned, she got a really good second story quest, and also events just centered around her. As bad as Inazuma was during its time, I think it was necessary. You know, Inazuma walked so Sumeru and hopefully future chapters could run. Inazuma is the last chapter that only had 3 acts. After Inazuma, the Archon quests are always split into 5 acts. We also never really got an NPC that takes too much of the screen time from characters again, like Teppei, and most of Sumeru, Fontaine, and Natlan casts are heavily featured in the Archon quests. In Sumeru, we got to spend a lot of time with the Eremites, and in Fontaine, we got to spend a lot of time with Navia and the Spina di Rosula. Both factions are very important to the Archon quests of their own respective nations, and they 100% gave the time to actually flesh them out, as opposed to us not spending any time with the Resistance, so it's definitely an improvement. A lot of the Inazuma characters were also given additional story quests or events, not just A. Even Yoimiya has a second story quest. And honestly, her second story quest was so good to me. It fleshed out Yoimiya as a character and why being able to hold on to some parts of our childhood innocence even as an adult is so important. And then of course, banger events like the Golden Apple Archipelago, where Kazuha basically got an extension of his own story quest. We even get dungeons that were made exclusively to explore his backstory. And honestly, that was one of the best events Genshin did at the time, and I wish that we could replay it because it does so much for the featured characters, not just Kazuha. There's also the Irodori Festival. Kazuha is somehow the character that they just continue to expand on, even indirectly. If you remember the Irodori Festival and the story of the 5 Kazen and also the Raiden Gokaden, you would remember that event was actually to introduce Scaramouche's lore and backstory, but at the same time, they were able to develop Kazuha's backstory even more because it's intertwined. Other than Scaramouche, the Irodori Festival actually allowed the exploration of different clans in Inazuma, like the Kamisato clan and obviously the Kaedehara clan, so it was cool to see that. And it was also cool to finally see a story that ties Scaramouche to Inazuma, because that is his homeland and he didn't really do anything while he was in Inazuma during the Archon quest. Kazuha even has a moment with Sarah because you know she's also culpable for the death of his best friend, so they've always had a really complicated dynamic, and in their interaction we can actually see Sarah being remorseful for what happened during the Vision Hunt decree, and Kazuha is, well, Kazuha, he was ready to move past it. It's a really great character interaction. So looking back, I do wish we could have a do-over of Inazuma because it had such interesting themes and had a lot of potential, but because of how the game was structured narratively back then, it fell flat. Because imagine an Inazuma Archon quest with 5 acts and without Teppei, but even without that, there's still hope that we get to see more of Inazuma's stories and characters from events like the last event that we got. Inazuma has a lot of nuanced and interesting characters that never really got the chance to shine, so here's hoping that when they do, people will give them a chance because they're really not that bad. That's all that I have to say, and believe it or not, Inazuma is actually the region where I was most invested in Genshin. Like, it was peak Genshin for me, and I did enjoy my playthrough of it, which is why I wish it was executed a lot better. But it always makes me super happy to see a familiar face from Inazuma every now and then. Let me know what you think of Inazuma. Do you guys like it or do you guys hate it? Let me know. And if you've made it this far, consider subscribing. Maybe. I don't know. If you don't want to, it's okay. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.